Hello everyone, welcome back to the Global Forest Summit co-organized by Reforestation and the Open Diplomacy Institute under the high patronage of Mr. Emmanuel Macron, President of the French Republic. This panel about forest and climate is bringing together prominent figures from all over the world. I'm very pleased to host Dr. Eva Müller. Hello, Eva. You're the Director General for Forest Sustainability and Renewable Resources at the German Federal Ministry for Food and Agriculture. Welcome. I also have the pleasure to host Dr. Thelma Krug, who is the Vice Chair of the IPCC at the global level. Hello, Thelma, from Brazil, I guess. We have Papis Skenemba Mbai joining us from Senegal, where he chairs the Sustainable Development Committee. He will connect to us on the phone since there are some connection issues with him. We are sorry about that. I am also very honored to host Musonda Mumbai. Hello, Musonda. You're the director of the UNDP Center for Climate and Sustainable Development and the Rome Center of the UNDP. Very welcome, Musonda. And two last speakers are Céline Soubran, the Chief Sustainability Officer at AXA. Hello, Céline. And Max Scher is the Head of Clean Energy and Carbon Program of Salesforce. Hello, Max. I am rushing a bit, welcoming you because we want to be on time for the next sessions. And we wanted to hear first to a wonderful young leader from the US, Alessandria Villaseñor, who is the founder of the Earth Uprising International and a member of the Fridays for Future movement. Alessandria, you will have a keynote speech of 10 minutes, very free, very, it's your way to introduce the panel about climate. We know future generations have a strong say on it, and it's your turn to take the lead of this Global Forest Summit.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. Good evening, everyone. I'm honored to join your summit today. So my name is Alexandra Villaseñor, and I'm a 15-year-old climate activist from the United States and the founder of Earth Uprising International. My climate story begins in 2018 and starts with the risk, vulnerability, and damage that has occurred to our forests due to climate change. I was only 13 when I was visiting my family in California and the Camp Fire broke out in Paradise, California. It quickly became the worst wildfire in California's history. It burned 250 square miles, destroyed 15,000 homes, and many people died. I have asthma and the smoke made me really ill. It took me a long time to recover. After this event, I began researching the wildfires and learned about the impact climate change has had on California's wildfires and wildfires all over the world, making them hotter and more intense than we've ever seen before. I then heard Greta Thunberg speak at COP24 and joined the climate strike movement. And since 2018, I've been organizing for the Fridays for Future movement, both internationally and here in the United States. However, the wildfires in 2018 were only the beginning of my awareness about climate change and forest health. Since that time, we have seen the largest wildfires burn in history, consuming over 4 million acres of forest in California this past year alone, and engulfing the entire Western United States in lung-damaging smoke for nearly 3 months. The cause of California's recent wildfires is complicated because for decades, our state has had a fire management plan that focused on fire suppression. Climate change-fueled mega droughts over the past 20 years have killed 150 million trees. One small little pest, the bark beetle, its populations booming also due to climate change, has killed another 100 million trees. And then there's the heat. Since the 1980s, California's average temperature has increased due to global warming, rising nearly 3 degrees Fahrenheit in only the last 40 years. All of these conditions worked together to cause devastation to the forest of California and the land I call home. and it also impacted my activism and the way I organize for climate action. During my organizing for the Fridays for Future movement, I quickly noticed how young people weren't informed about the climate crisis. Climate change isn't taught in many schools, and this negatively impacts our ability to prepare for our futures and make change in the world. To address this issue of youth climate education, I founded Earth Uprising International in April of 2019. And the mission of Earth Uprising is to educate young people on the climate crisis, peer-to-peer, and support them in taking direct action for their futures. Earth Uprising has grown so much over the past 2 years and now has youth-led chapters all over the world, and we still have so much more work to do. In the education Earth Uprising has created, we focus on solutions to the climate crisis. And some of these solutions are now being implemented right here in California. One of these solutions is a return to indigenous forest management. For many hundreds of years, Native Americans in California practiced controlled burns, keeping large-scale wildfires from happening and regenerating our forests. California is now working with these communities to reinitiate these traditional land management practices in order to care for our environment, communities, and our forests. I want to invite all of you here to get involved in climate action and climate solutions too. When people ask me how they can get involved in climate action, I always tell them that it's so important that they find their own climate story first. How is climate change impacting you personally or impacting your community? What kinds of local climate action is happening in your own community? Because once you find that personal connection to the climate crisis, then that will inform you on the kind of work you want to do. Then I encourage young people to find a climate group that they resonate with. It's so important for young people to develop relationships with each and work together on climate change. And that's what joining a local climate group will do. It will help you find your climate community. I also encourage young people to get involved politically. See, here in the United States, I'm still too young to vote. However, even when we can't vote, young people still have a lot of power. We can campaign for political candidates, educate one another and our communities, and organize around climate action together. Most importantly, though, is that we make noise. Young people are loud, and we can make our voices and perspectives heard. I also believe youth should be leading and pressuring our leaders on climate adaptation. See, climate change will affect every aspect of young people's lives, from where we go to school, to what kind of work we do, to whether or not we have children. Climate change is already causing the largest migration crisis the planet has ever seen. So youth have to push for climate adaptation, human rights, and migrant rights due to climate change. It's our future, and we need to own it and make the change that we want to see in the world. Again, I really appreciate you having me here today, and I want to thank all of you for your work, and I look forward to working with all of you in the future.
Thank you so much, Alexandria. You belong to this climate community, and the climate story that you called for everyone to find is for us a bit here today too. Many of our auditors and watchers will start their own climate story in listening to you. As you pointed out, indeed, we are in the facing of an emergency. The UN says themselves that 26, where we expect the NDCs to be delivered in Glasgow to achieve the goals that the Climate Paris Agreement has set of plus 1.5 degrees Celsius. We are way from that goal, and we certainly will get closer to plus 3 degrees, plus 3 degrees or more, which gets us to an unviable Earth. I'd like to turn to Thelma Krug, Vice Chair of the IPCC. Thelma, thank you very much for being with us. I know you've a lot on your plate at the IPCC these days ahead of COP26. I say that deforestation has decreased, but it remains massive, and it means it does accelerate the climate change. getting us way beyond the plus 1.5 Celsius degree objective. How do you assess this risk for the climate change issue?
Okay, thank you, Thomas. It's really a pleasure to be here and see all my friends. And since I am participating here as IPCC Vice Chair, all my interventions will have to be based on the IPCC assessments, and particularly the AR5, the fifth assessment report, the contribution of Working Group 3 that addresses mitigation of climate change, and where there is a specific chapter that addresses agriculture, forestry, and other land use. We cannot forget also that we have two recent important special reports that came in 2018 and 2019. The first one is really global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the other one that relates to this issue, which is the climate change and land. So you have updated information from these two reports. Now, if I go to the AR5, in there, the contribution or the forestry and other land uses accounted for approximately 12% of the anthropogenic CO2 emissions from 2000 and 2009. This didn't change much in the last years. And also there was an agreement that has been a decline in the forest and other land use CO2 emissions over the most recent years, largely due to the decrease in the rate of deforestation. So to respond to your question, I think I would like to contextualize this under the Paris Agreement, and basically on the issue of holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing the efforts to hold or to limit the temperature increase to 1.5, since you mentioned that. So obviously, deforestation is a source of emissions, right? And particularly CO2, but it can also be a source of other greenhouse gas emissions if, for instance, you have fire-related deforestation, and then you can have methane, nitrous oxide, aerosols, black carbon, and many other important emissions there. Now, most of the IPCC assessed model emission pathways that limited the global warming to 1.5 until the end of the century, the CO2 emissions would have to be reduced to net zero globally around 2050. And obviously, this is expected also to be applied to deforestation as well, right? So obviously, there are carbon dioxide measures that I am sure we are going to be addressing later on in this chat. Also, these measures can be taken to balance the residual CO2 emissions, including from potentially deforestation, but also from other sources, and in particular energy, that is responsible for about 75% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. So there are initiatives under the Climate Change Convention, most specifically the REDD+, that provides developing countries incentives to reduce emissions from deforestation through results-based payments, not only to reduce deforestation, but also to reduce emissions from forest degradation and also other activities. But, you know, just a point, normally when we think about all this issue, we think about deforestation only. But let's not forget that forest degradation can be as important a source of emissions as deforestation.
We'll cover that specific topic, which is very important, later in the run of our conversation. I'd like to turn to Eva from the German Ministry of Food and Agriculture. Eva, we've been talking to each other and witnessing the fact that international events bring this topic every year since a long time, and we can get a bit bored of it. So that is why my question is very targeted on solutions to fight against deforestation. Thelma Krug has mentioned the REDD+ initiative, but we have adopted in 2014 the New York Declaration on Forests, And we are now in the course of reviewing the UN Strategic Plan for Forests between 2017 and 2030. So my question is, how can we, on those declarations, legally binding instruments that help us fight clearly on deforestation for the sake of climate ambition?
Thank you very much first for having me in this conference, and I'm going to try to respond to your question. As you said rightly, in 2014, we had the New York Declaration on Forests. And one of the commitments in this declaration was to reduce by at least 50% the loss of natural forests by 2020 and to end natural forest loss by 2030. Then we had the SDGs in 2015, and the Sustainable Development Goal 15 on life on land has a target to halt deforestation already by 2020. And finally, you mentioned the UN Strategic Plan on Forests that was adopted in 2017 by the General Assembly. That aims to reverse the loss of forest cover worldwide with a target to increase forest area worldwide by 3% in 2030. So there's no lack of ambition and commitments on paper, but as you said, today in 21, we are still far from achieving these goals and targets. And the FAO Global Forest Resources Assessment shows that we have not stopped deforestation. It does not mean that there hasn't been progress, but progress is too slow. And when I was in FAO in 2018, we organized an international conference on halting deforestation. And many of the key players were involved in this. And we came to the conclusion that despite all these positive initiatives and projects that are already going on and that are showing results, there's still an urgent need for accelerating and upscaling. And since then, there have been further commitments, there have been further initiatives. Just to give you an example, my country, Germany, is a member, initiator, or supporter of the New York Declaration on Forests, the Bonn Challenge, the Amsterdam Partnership, the Tropical Forest Alliance, and most recently, the Alliance for the Conservation of Rainforests, just to name a few. And we are also among the biggest donors for forests globally. In 2019, our financial support to results-based payments for REDD+ alone amounted to 63 million euro. So there's a lot going on. There is progress being made. And to me, a promising approach seems to be the initiatives that have been launched that are either legislative or non-legislative related to agricultural commodities in the countries, in the EU, and by the private sector that do address the whole supply chain of agricultural commodities. In Germany, for example, last year we adopted national guidelines for deforestation-free supply chains of agricultural commodities. And this approach seems to be promising because on the one hand, it responds to consumer calls for responsible consumption. And on the other hand, it targets directly the most important cause of deforestation, which is still the conversion of forests to agricultural uses.
That is a topic we will cover in depth, as it's the key issue here. Where reviewing this deforestation drama, as I said, from the northern perspective, as we just did with Eva Müller speaking from Germany, is one thing. Looking at it from the global south perspective is even more dramatic. I'd like to turn to Musonda Mumba, which I wrongly introduced earlier. She's the director of the Rome Center for Sustainable Development, Nature, Climate and Energy at the UNDP. Sorry for the misintroduction. And Musonda, could you tell us a bit more on the way you see it from the global south, from those countries which need to adapt, to mitigate, and to grow at the same time?
Thank you so very much for inviting me to this Global Forest Summit. I think I just want to build up a little bit on what Eva said and really building up a little bit on the science from Thelma. I think what's very important is that, yes, you know, the African continent is the host of the largest sort of forest landmass, the Congo Basin forest landscape, but also we have mosaic savanna landscapes that are so critical and so important. And I think building up a bit on what Eva has mentioned on these, you know, deforestation-free commodities, we are a connected world. And as such, you know, you cannot have your coffee as you're sitting in Paris, because coffee comes from some part either in Ethiopia or, you know, Rwanda or in the Congo or even in here in Kenya where I am. So when we talk about these landscapes and the policies that exist, it's very important to bear in mind that a lot of countries are committed to specific frameworks. And I'm glad that Eva touched on that as well. You know, for instance, the FR 100, the Africa Forest and Landscape Restoration Initiative, where many African countries have really basically talked about commitments to reforestation. But perhaps on what you talk about, the challenges and the levels of degradation, Ebola is a zoonotic disease as a result of forest, etc., of degradation. And so we know that as a result of this conversion and these changes, we are even putting ourselves more at risk. And here we are in a pandemic world now, you know, connected via Zoom and other mediums. But I also want to mention a bit on what Alexandra mentioned in her talk about the role of Indigenous peoples. A lot of these landscapes, traditional communities have had traditional mechanisms of managing these landscape systems. And I think that's also an important element of bearing in mind, this traditional knowledge as it connects and bridges to conventional science. So it's very much important to make these connections as well.
I strongly appreciate you pointed this out, and we've clearly understood that the deforestation drama is indeed a climate disaster, but in turn, climate change weakens forests, and it does amplify the problem. So I'd like to turn back to Eva Müller to understand how we can make forest restoration a tool for adaptation to climate change too, to understand the way forests could help us in adapting to this climate disaster.
I would say for forests, climate change mitigation and adaptation are very, very closely linked. So efforts to strengthen the mitigation potential can often contribute to adaptation and vice versa. Let me just give you one example. In Germany, in the last 3 years, we've had serious damages to our forests due to climate change related extreme weather events combined with severe insect attacks. We lost about 270,000 hectares or 2.5% of our total forest area that now have to be restored or reforested. And this is very important to us because in order to achieve our climate targets, we cannot afford to lose part of our forest area. We need to maintain and continue to sustainably manage all our forests because our forests are an important carbon sink, and due to the damages that we have now, they're in danger of becoming a carbon source. But we also know that we need to make our forests more resilient to climate change to avoid further damages. And that means we cannot just restore our forests to the previous state, but we have to strive for a different type of forest, a more mixed forests, including different species and adapted silvicultural regimes to reduce the risk. Because at this point, we do not know exactly what our future forests will look like to withstand climate change. So therefore, our short-term strategy is risk reduction. And at the same time, we need to intensify research because we need to know more about drought resistance of tree species, for example, and also silvicultural practices for the future. So if we want to generalize the lessons learned from what we have experienced in Germany, I would say that mitigation and adaptation have to be thought together. And because of climate change, in many cases, forests cannot be restored to their original state. Because of the uncertainty about how to best adapt forests to climate change, we need to adopt risk reduction strategies. And there's also a need to generate more knowledge about climate resilient forests and to improve our capability to identify the best future species compositions, tree breeding methods, and silvicultural practices. In this, regional cooperation, cross-border cooperation, at least in Europe, plays an important role. And we have a good example there, that's the Pan-European forest process. And the last point I want to make is that we need to provide support in particular to the small forest and landowners, because they are the ones that will be the most affected and the least capable to deal with the restoration and reforestation needs on their own.
It is very indeed important, as we've been saying the whole morning, to humbly recognize and acknowledge that restoration of forest will never be as clever as nature has created forests, and that we will lose part of the ecosystem services that we will along deforestation, so that adaptation capabilities through reforestation are less efficient than reduction of deforestation or fighting against deforestation himself. I'd like to address in this topical discussion about the fact that climate change amplifies the problem and weakens forests further when we talk about mitigation itself. Tropical forests could become, some say that tropical forests could at some point become net positive emitters. It is something that is, from a physical perspective, reviewed at the IPCC. And I'd like to ask Thelma to let us know a bit more about the research behind that, because indeed, if we do believe that forests are our allies and that turn back on us being our enemies in fighting climate change, what can we hope from it?
So that's an interesting question, Thomas, because forests have this potential to be both large sources of greenhouse gases, as well as large sinks of CO2 from the atmosphere, right? So removing CO2 from the atmosphere. However, forests are highly vulnerable. So even if you refrain from deforestation, obviously we have events such as drought that are becoming increasingly more relevant. And if you think that drought is one of the key drivers of fires that Alexandria has addressed so nicely in the keynote speech, I would say that, yes, indeed, responding objectively to you, yes, it could go from being source and going to be a net emitter, independently of the human will to prevent that from happening. So I think that as climate change aggravates, as the temperature increases, then these extreme events, these climatic events will put at stake, could put at stake a large part of the forests, including the tropical forests, and in particular.
That is very scaring, because we've always hoped, and that is the sake of this Global Forest Summit, that forests could be the ally we need to conserve, to protect, to restore, and to sustain, to manage both the climate crisis, the health crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and some part of the economic crisis we're facing. But if it turns out that at some point forests, because of climate change, can be a danger to our local ecosystems, I'm curious, and it means a lot of impact on the global South economy that relies on the primary sector. Musonda, you've had an extensive experience in African countries at the UNDP. How do you think that this is anticipated by the least developed countries that you're helping most at the UNDP?
So you see, I think I want to also just build a little bit on what Thelma has said. I think we also have to bear in mind that when we talk about forests, we're talking about systems, collective systems, not just, the standing trees, the biodiversity that they support. And in many instances across Africa, the cultures that they support, and they're also food systems. And as such, as we support governments across the African continent, we're talking very much around systems thinking. A lot of times we're talking about, the innovation around, for instance, the policies, when we talk about the technologies that are used in terms of managing these ecosystems. So it's very important to bear in mind that even as countries, prepare and review their NDCs, they're talking about these spaces in a very holistic and collective way, and in a systems thinking way. I also want to mention that, the issue of trade is obviously a very critical matter, because a lot of the timber, for instance, or agriculture products that are coming in from, these commodities that are finding themselves in Europe also have to be borne in mind that we need this element of traceability, knowing whether the sources are obviously, sustainable sources, and also they're borne in mind that these, for instance, forest certification mechanisms are in place when products are sourced, etc. And so we're trying to support governments at the local level to understand, these connectivities to these policy frameworks. And it's very important that they bear in mind that all of this is very connected, especially within the frame of climate change.
Thank you, Musonda, for tackling this question. We see it from the beginning of the panel and since the keynote of Alessandria. Facing deforestation, it needs strong and immediate action because of the emergency we are in. And if we look at the solutions that we have, that are quick and as bold as possible, the first and foremost one is stop deforestation. I know that Germany is part of the High Ambition Coalition. I'd like to ask Eva Müller from the German Ministry of Food and Agriculture what it does mean and how it can achieve a definitive stop to deforestation that has decreased, certainly, but remains off the surface of Ireland every year.
How do you stop deforestation? I think that's the question nobody has been able to answer yet, because we still haven't stopped it. There has been a lot of talk about needing more legal commitments, an internationally binding agreement on forests. That has been attempted numerous times, both at the global level and at the regional level. And we still don't have a legally binding agreement on forests. There was no forest convention coming out of the Rio process. In 2000, the United Nations Forum on Forests was established. And finally, the UNFF achieved a fairly weak, non-legally binding instrument that was subsequently pretty much ignored by most of the countries, or not actively pursued. In Europe, we had for a while also an attempt to create a legal agreement on forests for Europe, and for a number of reasons, this also did not come to fruition.
There is one initiative that could make a difference, which is the European law to fight against imported deforestation. At the European scale, because you just put us in the European arena, which is very relevant, there is this bill on the way to preparation to fight against imported deforestation and to make sure that supply chains that bring us products and services in Europe, the second widest single market on the globe, is not importing deforestation. Do you think that that is one of the policy solutions we can achieve on the short run?
Well, as I said earlier, I think one of the promising approaches is to look at the whole supply chain. And this is what is happening also in Europe now. The EU is developing legislation and also non-legislative approaches to ensure deforestation-free supply chains for agro-commodities, similarly to what we have done at the national level that I mentioned before. We also have some examples at the European level for the EU timber regulation, the voluntary partnership agreements to fight illegal logging, and those were instruments developed where support was provided to the developing countries as a complement to the agreements. And I think this is also a very important point. And the third point is that when we talk about deforestation, I don't think we will achieve much by an intergovernmental agreement alone, because the private sector plays a huge role in the issue of deforestation. So we need to make sure that we have the private sector on board. And that is happening, has been happening, is increasingly happening through voluntary commitments that create win-win situations. And I think that's the key. You know, if we can create these win-win situations involving the private sector, then even if we don't have legal agreements, we can achieve more.
That is, thank you for raising that point, because that's one of the key aspects we wanted to talk in this Global Forest Summit, that is multi-stakeholder approaches and ambitions that can help us deliver on the quick run in the short term. And that is why we've been speaking already about supply chains responsibility with the leaders from JPMS, from Salesforce, from Procter & Gamble in the morning. We have two different companies around the table now that I'd like to turn to, not because of the supply chains, but because of their approaches to forest sustainability. They've brought other approaches than the one based on supply chains. First, I'd like to ask Max Scher. Max is the head of Clean Energy and Carbon Program of Salesforce, which has recently announced important figures and objectives for reforestation. We say that reduction of carbon emissions is key before getting for offsetting. Conservation of nature is first and foremost important before reforesting. But when it comes to massive reforestation efforts like the one Salesforce is getting into, could you tell us a bit more on the way you envisioned this net zero emission ambition, Max?
Absolutely, and absolute honor, pleasure to be here with the fantastic panelists here. You know, I think your question touches on both climate and nature, and I'll start with the climate answer. I mean, you know, for companies, for everyone, you know, we're at a moment of action, and you know, for a lot of time we've been slowly scaling our climate efforts as a community, but this is a moment that we need to step up, and at Salesforce we talk about putting our full power towards climate action, and I think that's key. For us, you know, that means thinking about what we're making, thinking about how we're making it, and thinking about our influence along the way. And putting that full power towards demonstrating climate action, enabling climate action, and mobilizing climate action, you know, with our influence. And, you know, the same is true for nature. You know, when it comes to these global goals, we need to be, you know, uniting around them as a global community. And you know, at Salesforce, when we think about nature, we think about it as part of the climate solution, but it's also, you know, a bouquet sustainable development solution, obviously, as we've heard from all the other speakers here today. And it needs to be tackled.
Max has disconnected. He will be back, I'm sure, to explain us how he does envision the climate strategy of Salesforce for the sake of forestation. While he's reconnected, I'd like to turn to Céline Subran. Céline, you're the Chief Sustainability Officer of AXA, one of the main global insurance firms. And finance, indeed, has a very specific role to play, both in fighting climate disruptions as a whole, but specifically as for considering forests as an asset to invest in. How do you envision this? What is the role that you play as an insurance company to reorient investment in these assets?
Yes, it's sometimes less obvious to see the link between the financial sector and the, yes, the question linked to biodiversity and notably the forest. But yes, the journey we have started at AXA is really to make us conscious that the way we orient financial flow through the way we proceed, we make the choice for climate change, for biodiversity loss, and for forests. That's why we published 2 years ago a report about, in partnership with WWF, on how can finance industry as a whole better integrate into the investment decision and into the insurance decision the risk to lose biodiversity, with the interesting connection it has with climate change, and it was very well covered by the previous speaker, and that's why we asked for the creation of a TNFD, Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosure. And because we need metrics, we need trajectory to integrate these stakes into our investment and insurance decision. And today, we have two main tools as an investor to orient the financial flow in the right direction. The first one is the exclusion, and at AXA we really world the talk. Since 2013, we have a palm oil policy, very linked to the deforestation stakes, because we have decided to exclude unsustainable practices for palm oil production from our investments. And we will update very soon this policy with more commitments around deforestation and World Heritage Site policy. So that's the first tool, exclusion. But I think what is more important is also the positive investment we can make to protect and restore the forest. And that's why impact investing is a very interesting tool, because impact investing at AXA, it's not philanthropy, it's really project in which we invest, and that delivers both positive financial outcome, but also positive impact on the environment and forest. There was the example before by a previous speaker of coffee plants, for example. In our current impact fund about climate change and biodiversity, for example, we invest in a project of cocoa plants in Madagascar, which allow to the community, because I think there is close link between the social issue and the forest issue. So we help the communities to be in capacity to have revenues from these cocoa plants, but with sustainable and new practice to protect these areas, and to protect also the habitat for species, and to combine the production of cocoa with a responsible way to protect the forest around, and to improve the agroforestry practices. We have invested 350 billion in this new impact fund dedicated to climate and biodiversity, and we have a lot of examples on how we promote new sustainable management of culture and agroforestry practices. So two tools in a nutshell, two tools: exclusion and impact investing are the main tool we have to protect forests.
I'm curious about the exclusion aspect that you mentioned. I set aside the impact investing that you've outlined very clearly. As when it relates to exclusion, and I'm here in a more B2B perspective, does this mean that you now refuse to cover the insurance of any business that provokes deforestation, that deforests?
We started with palm oil, unsustainable palm oil practices, and we will continue very soon. We are building up currently a new policy around that with our partner WWF. It's something we are very committed at AXA because, as you may know, on the climate change, we have excluded already, for example, all the coal, the coal industry. Yes, that's something. It's really a very useful tool. And what is interesting if it becomes a collective effort, because again, if AXA alone exclude palm oil or deforestation or coal, it's not enough. So we really try, and that's really the purpose we had with this famous Into the Wild report with WWF. It's to make move the whole finance sector with us.
Remaining the B2B era, I'd like to turn back to Max, who has managed to reconnect. And thank you, Max. We are sorry that we lost you a bit of time. Salesforce is a B2B company. You provide CRM to many companies or organizations. And as you've said, you've quite a commitment to achieve reforestation programs. Could you use your B2B position on the market to inspire other businesses, maybe not in the tech sectors, but those clients you have that buy your CRMs, to follow your lead and be part of this generation of entrepreneurs?
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry about that. Absolutely. With Sustainability Cloud in particular, which we launched actually at the World Economic Forum in concert a couple months ago, we're trying to enable our customers in the transition to net zero, but a critical part of that is going to be nature, understanding supply chains. And that's customer facing kind of B2B, but every company has a supply chain and the ability to engage them, to push them, whether you're a tech company or you're an agricultural company, to try and get them to take these kinds of initiatives on. And it's one of the most promising things that I see out there in the corporate space right now, because it has the ability to create a network effect that'll really drive some meaningful change. Our technology in particular can be useful for this sort of endeavor. And we've looked to enable a few different activities, in concert with the World Economic Forum, in support of the Sustainable Development Goals, and most recently in support of the 1T.org effort, which we helped them launch. We actually have built a platform called Uplink, which helps to crowdsource innovative solutions to the Sustainable Development Goals. It's built on Salesforce technology, and has had over 250 solutions submitted already by ecopreneurs around the world working on this topic, which is obviously critical to scaling the whole movement.
It does mean that you will be part of this net zero global coalition that the UN Secretary General calls for action, that brings together governments, organizations from the private sector, from the public sector, from the non-governmental sector. But I'm very curious, and this is a specific bone of contention we need to address in our discussions about climate. The question of offsetting, which is upsetting, I should say. Achieving carbon neutrality through reforestation, it could be a wrong-way risk. Is it really a real opportunity? Should we not, Thelma, I'm asking you this question, better incentivize agri-food company to shift towards something different than deforestation, or should we keep having offsetting?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Thomas. Yes, I'm gonna respond to your question if, reforestation would be the wrong way risk or real opportunity first. And I would say that obviously, when you look at the IPCC, we would not put all the coins in reforestation to neutralize the carbon emissions, right? And there is a simple reason for that, because the situation may be so bad that you would need to have really large scale reforestation in order to offset or to balance this residual CO2. So IPCC says that the best approach would be really to have a portfolio of mitigation actions that would include, as it did in the 1.5 global warming special report, alongside with many other potential measures that you could take. So if we think about large scale reforestation and the potential impact that it may have for food, for the food security, and also potentially increasing the price of food if you are really devoting your land to reforest, to balance the carbon emissions or to neutralize the carbon emissions. This would really be one of the trade-offs that you would have. Very negative trade-off, I would say. So essentially, there are lots of things that we need to think of, like agroforestry, like sustainable forest management as part of this package, alongside with many other measures that IPCC nicely puts forward in the 1.5 special report.
What is interesting when we look at the global governance of the environment history is that we in the climate realm, is that we shifted from the Kyoto Protocol, which was about cap and trade, which means offsetting emissions, to another framework in 2015 at the COP21 when we adopted the Paris Climate Agreement, which is enabling broader contributions to the fight against climate change, revolving around the different policies that you mentioned. But I'm still a bit curious on knowing to make sure that the business coalitions that we've been speaking about can go way beyond carbon neutrality by offsetting using forests. This is what we discussed this morning as a nature positive approach, or not only net zero deforestation. Do you think it's something you could achieve at Salesforce or at AXA? Max and Celine. Max first, maybe? Something net positive?
Well, I mean, it's a lot easier for us because of the type of sector we're in, right? So I hope that we are quickly nature positive and, you know, looking forward to the guidance on exactly what that means and the standards that are behind it. You know, to the previous comment though, we you know, with climate, with nature, you know, we need complementary goals rather than, you know, in climate, the proliferation of net zero targets to actually reduce emissions and offset is going to be critical, because we can do a lot as Salesforce as well, even when it comes to deforestation, not a lot to reduce in our supply chain, but we can also be having an and target to invest and support around the world. So, I mean, you know, in general, yes, absolutely. And I hope that we are one of the first folks to help the world get there.
That is something positive we hear here. But turning back to Celine, do you think that in an insurance company where you have so many assets and investments all around the world, do you think you could shift it towards something nature positive?
Yes, I think that we are already engaged on that, and I think there is today a lot of net zero trajectory for investment, for insurance activity, and for our own operation also, notably the digital activity, because we are really a tech-led companies and we are committed to decrease our environmental footprint and to offset the remaining emissions. Yes, and I think it's just the beginning of the story for the financial sector, and we are waiting a lot, notably the COP15 in Kunming, because again, for the financial sector, what is key is really the metrics and the trajectory, the collective trajectory we will build up together to really have an impact and to take, yes, into consideration the biodiversity loss and the issue around the forest into our investment and insurance decision.
That is very clear. It gives us sparks of hope that we can go beyond a net zero coalition that the UN Secretary General has called for action, which is going to be difficult though, and we need to also envision other ways to achieve forest protection for the sake of climate adaptation and mitigation. That's why I wanted to get back to the subject of sustainable management of forests and looking at what it does mean concretely on the ground for those entrepreneurs, local communities who manage forests. Musonda, you're working at the UNDP and helping many project leaders and governments to build their capabilities to achieve these goals. What would be the recommendations you could make to achieve this new sustainable management practices? What would be the best practices you'd like to share?
Thank you so very much for that question. I think I just want to build up a little bit on Celine's point, really, because I think for us, what's important within the work that we've done and supported to government is that we have moved towards having this green commodity community. So bringing together different stakeholders, different private sector entities, public sector entities, the investors, etc., and the communities themselves, because ultimately in really dealing with the landscape and nature, we have to bear in mind that people are involved. So in our work in Liberia, for instance, on palm oil, or in Cote d'Ivoire on cocoa, and Ghana on cocoa, even as somebody is having that chocolate in the middle of Paris, I think they have to bear in mind that this value chain is a sustainable value chain. And more so now, I think with the restoration agenda, some of the best case studies that we're beginning to see is that as we encourage, restoration, we also have to bear in mind that we're in the middle of a green recovery. How do we encourage these green jobs, greenpreneurs, but also beginning to see the connectivity to many other different sectors that also have implications on the forest sector, energy, for instance, sustainable consumption and all of that. So the interconnectivity of these very sectors. So it's very important in our work and within the constituency of the UNDP and the UN family more broadly, but also working with other stakeholders, that we make sure that this comes to the fore as well.
Thank you so much, Musonda, for tackling that question. You've been very clear on the importance of a green recovery to achieve this. That is some of the objectives of the EU Next Generation Recovery Plan that has been put forward last summer, which has paved the way for more means to achieve the ecological transition. We are on the verge to get the forest EU strategy. Eva, you belong to certainly those EU government branches that prepare this forest strategy. What do you expect from it to make sure that the EU remains leading by example on this issue?
Thank you. In Europe, we have a long history of sustainable forest management, and this is very important because we believe that through sustainable forest management, you can actually optimize the potential of forests for climate change mitigation, because it combines the carbon storage in the standing forests with carbon storage in harvested wood, and so on. In Germany alone, we save about 14% of national emissions just by this, by sustainable forest management, with all it encompasses. The EU is now preparing a new forest strategy, and there's a heated debate going on about the future of the forests in the EU and which is the best way to ensure that they contribute to climate change mitigation and also to the conservation of biodiversity. And there are many calls for a different approach, strict protection, meaning not using the forest anymore, because the arguments are that protected forests become older, they store more carbon, they're better for climate change mitigation and biodiversity. And this is going to play a very important role in the development of this new EU forest strategy that the Commission will be presenting sometime in the coming months. In preparation for this, last year under the German Council presidency, The member states of the European Council have already issued some council conclusions to provide some guidance to the European Commission on the orientation and direction of the new EU forest strategy. And they were very clear about where they stand on this question of managing forests or protecting forests or doing both. In their conclusions, they emphasized that the strategy should help to achieve the objectives of multifunctional and sustainable forest management in accordance with the 3 pillars of sustainability and with internationally agreed principles. And they also see the forest sector and the forest-based sectors as a solution rather than a problem. They also said they want to see a strong coherence of the new forest strategy with the other strategies at the EU level. There's a new biodiversity strategy, for example, and that you need to look at what the impacts of these strategies could be. One example, the biodiversity strategy calls for very strict protection targets, strong protection targets, meaning a target of 10% strictly protected areas, including specifically primary and old growth forests. According to some preliminary studies of scientists, it was shown that this protection target could lead up to 40% of domestic timber in the EU not being met by 2050. And that would in turn lead to considerable leakage effects to other forest regions outside of the EU. So wood would have to be imported, and imported possibly from areas where there are less clear rules on sustainable forest management. We are looking for an EU forest strategy that confirms the importance of sustainable and multifunctional forest management in Europe.
Yeah, and you've been stressing very clearly the importance of strict protection, which is key here to achieve the goal that we have laid out. I recall that we are now in the hottest decade ever in human history. That is 3 degrees Celsius above the average in the Arctic, and plus 5 degrees Celsius in northern Siberia, with a very dangerous path ahead of COP26 for climate, as UN speaks already about the risk of a global disaster. We missed our fellow Pape Mbaye from Senegal, who we tried to connect, and that's why we were so late, by the phone, as he had troubles to be there with Zoom. But he has sent me a text that I will read to recap the points he wanted to make about the way he sees this issue for African forests, where he looks at the subject, which is the mangrove. He is very keen on fighting for mangrove resilience in a strategy for climate change, which actually concerns the whole Western Africa. And he says that there are 4 keys to strengthen the resilience of the mangrove to face global warming. First, in his eyes, it is about strengthening the legal and institutional framework. And I guess that what has been said about the importance of taking global supply chains, especially in trade agreements, is very key here. But it's also applicable at the local level. Second idea I wanted to make is that conservation, restoration, and a rational reuse of mangroves is key. And we are all insisting together this day in this Global Forest Summit that conservation comes first. It's the key that we need to look at first. Third idea he wanted to share with us is he looks for the establishment of sustainable financing mechanism, which revolves around the questions that Céline has laid about the impact investing from the private sector, but it also echoes public financial institutions, development banks, and we will have the opportunity to talk about this in the closing panel. And fourth idea he wanted to put forward, he's looking for the establishment of an alternative livelihoods for rural communities and especially for women. We've not addressed during today's discussions the difference of impact that climate change has between men and women. That is a topic we could have been discussing. We are still very close to the 8th of March, the International Women's Day. But he's insisting himself a lot about this, as well as the inclusion of rural communities. I'm very sorry that, Pape, you could not have been with us today for the connection issues, but your message has been delivered, and I'd like to make a vow. I do hope that Alexandria has convinced you to find your climate story, starting from today, and that this climate story will be able to revolve around the different solutions that our panelists have laid out. We need to be bold, we need to be ambitious on that side, and this is how I'll wrap up this conversation, also by thanking Eva from the German Ministry of Food and Agriculture, Thelma Krug from the IPCC, Musonda Mumba from the UNDP, Céline Subran from AXA, Max Scher from Salesforce, as well as Alexandria Villesianer from Earth Uprising. Thank you all. We will be resuming the Global Forest Summit next session very shortly. Let's meet in the next 5 minutes.